Welcome, enlightened ones. Never let your cup get full. We will begin with AI's blind interpretation. Prepare to witness what the algorithms predict.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, today we are strapping in for a really fascinating deep dive into what is basically a piece of modern poetry, exploring the absolute extremes of human psychology. We're unpacking the thematic text of Tool's seminal track, Opiate. Now, obviously, we already know the track absolutely rocks, but the lyrics? They actually serve as this masterful, super dark case study on two fundamental human struggles. We're talking about the terrifying burden of control and our desperate, almost instinctual need for escapism. We're going to look at exactly how people surrender their autonomy, how authoritative figures exploit that surrender, and, well, where it all ultimately leads. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. That opening lyrical hook instantly sets up our whole psychological premise. Choices always were a problem for you. Just think about the sheer weight of that statement for a second. We live in a world that constantly tells us free will is our greatest asset, right? But let's be totally honest here. Psychologically speaking, having to constantly make choices is exhausting. It carries the weight of responsibility, the constant fear of making the wrong move, the crushing pressure of just navigating life. So this simple sentence completely dismantles that illusion of strength. It exposes a really profound human vulnerability, that secret lingering desire to just have someone else take the wheel.
To really understand the depths of this text, we'll be taking a 5-part journey today. We're going to quickly hit 1, the burden of choice, 2, the false savior, 3, the plea for light, 4, chemical escapism, and finally, number 5, the final apathy.
Starting right off with Section 1, the burden of choice and the vulnerability of free will. So, on one side of this dynamic, we have the follower. They're described in the text as deaf and blind and dumb and born to follow. Now, sure, that sounds incredibly harsh, but psychologically, it actually represents a highly desired state of being. The follower literally wants to be numb. They want to be deaf to all the noise, blind to our super complex reality, and entirely absolved of the need to speak or make decisions. And what happens? Well, this creates a massive vacuum of power. A vacuum that is immediately filled by the absolute authority of the leader on the other side, who steps in presenting themselves as strong and guiding.
And that entire dynamic really crystallizes in this specific line, what you need is someone strong to guide you. It's whispered almost seductively in the text. It exposes that deep-seated, very human desire to just surrender the heavy, complicated burden of free will to a supposedly stronger figure. It's the ultimate promise of safety, right? It's the promise of, hey, you know what? You don't have to figure this out anymore. I'll just do it for you. But as we're about to see, giving up your agency absolutely always comes with a terrifyingly high price tag.
Which brings us to Section 2, the false savior, and the exploitation of faith.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how perfectly we can map out the transactional nature of this relationship. Look at the breakdown here. The command is super simple. Trust in me now and just do everything I tell you. But the condition for receiving that guidance? Well, you have to agree that you are broken and you have to promise not to judge or question. So yeah, this is definitely not mutual growth. It perfectly illustrates the transactional repetition you hear in the chorus. It shows us exactly how blind faith is demanded in exchange for relief from that burden of choice. You're told you're fundamentally flawed, and your only possible cure is absolute, unquestioning obedience.
Now, before we look at the next lyric, we really need to define the exact psychological mechanism at play here, which is subjugation. That is the action of bringing someone or something under complete domination or control. I want to provide this crucial piece of context because the text uses an extreme, highly provocative metaphor of physical violation in its post-chorus, and it uses that to represent exactly what is happening to the follower's mind and autonomy.
And here is where we see that ultimate subjugation weaponized. My God's will becomes me. When he speaks through me. I mean, it is an absolute masterclass in manipulation. The savior figure here is claiming total divine authority. By equating their own personal desires with the unquestionable will of God, they completely mask their own predatory needs. They actually follow this up with lines stating that both they and God want to violate the follower. It's a stark, frankly shocking metaphor for the complete and utter destruction of the follower's personal boundaries and agency. And it's justified entirely by this impenetrable shield of manufactured divinity.
Moving on to Section 3,
the plea for light, and desperate blindness.
So, how does the follower react? Well, instead of fighting back, they actually lean in harder. Just listen to these pleas straight from the chorus. Jesus Christ, why don't you come save my life now? They're begging for an external savior. But notice the incredible lyrical paradox in these next two lines. Open my eyes, which is then directly followed by blind me with your light now. They're literally begging for their eyes to be opened, theoretically so they can see the truth, but simultaneously asking to be blinded by the light. It perfectly represents this overwhelming desire to escape reality entirely. They don't actually want the truth. They want a massive sensory experience that completely erases their ability to perceive the pain of their subjugation. Basically, they want the ultimate opiate.
That takes us to Section 4, Chemical Escapism and the Gaping Lotus Experience.
And this brilliantly illustrates a completely different approach to the same problem. The text suddenly shifts entirely away from those heavy, gothic religious themes we've been talking about, and instead presents this clinically absurd list of behaviors from a friend who took acid and ecstasy. I mean, we're talking about a guy believing he was a fire engine, urinating on a lighter, trying to marry everyone in the room, and, yep, attempting to physically romance a lazy boy armchair. It's totally ridiculous, it's incredibly messy, but functionally, it is exactly the same as the religious surrender from Part 1. It's a complete abdication of rational thought, personal responsibility, and free will. It's just achieved through chemical means rather than ideological ones.
And then, right smack in the middle of these bizarre drug stories, we get this incredibly jarring, repetitive refrain: Satan, 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 Satan. It acts as a brilliantly dark, satirical contrast to those desperate, earnest pleas for Jesus Christ that we analyzed in the first half of the explainer. It really underscores the sheer absurdity of both extremes, because whether you're crying out for divine salvation while actively being exploited, or chanting about the devil while hallucinating in your living room, you are fundamentally engaging in the exact same psychological mechanism. You're just hiding from reality.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 5. The final apathy, and the void of escapism.
The end result of all this is simply this phrase, I'm getting bored. Over and over, the outro of the text just repeats this incredibly stark, hollow line, I'm getting bored. After all the intense religious trauma, after all the mind-altering chemical chaos, it all just fizzles out into a vast, empty void. This heavily repeated line reveals the ultimate crushing tragedy of the text. Neither blind obedience to a false savior nor radical chemical distraction actually provides any kind of fulfillment. Escaping your free will doesn't bring you peace, it just leaves you entirely, soul-crushingly numb. The opiate always wears off eventually, leaving you with absolutely nothing but boredom.
So the absolutely crucial point we're left with today is this lingering question: whether through blind faith or altered states, how far will we really go to avoid making our own choices? Toole's text brilliantly forces us to look in the mirror and critically examine our own mechanisms of escape. Are we actually facing the heavy burden of our own autonomy head-on, or are we secretly out there looking for someone or something to just blind us with the light? It's a genuinely terrifying concept to reflect on. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer today. Take some time to ponder that one, and I'll see you next time.
That was AI's blind interpretation. Will it hold up to an interpretation that is guided with notes and references? Do you believe that one of these videos will ever go right? Ha ha, no way! You decide.
All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a piece of music history that is honestly just as controversial as it is intellectually dense. Toole's 1992 track, Opiate. Now, at first listen, this thing just hits you like an absolute wall of raw, aggressive punk metal. But if you dig just a little bit past that abrasive surface, you'll actually find a highly complex philosophical critique that still hits incredibly hard today. So we're going to deconstruct exactly what the band was trying to say, how they said it, and how the physical song itself literally manipulated the listener. It's going to be a fun ride.
To help us navigate all this provocative art, here is our roadmap. First, we'll look at religion as a sedative. Second, unpacking shocking metaphors. Third, a psychedelic tonal reset. And finally, 30 years of evolution.
All right, Section 1, Religion as a Sedative. You know, the actual foundation of this song traces all the way back to 1844, when the philosopher Karl Marx famously argued that religion was the opium of the people. He was essentially proposing that religion functioned as a sedative, right? In his view, it was used by the ruling classes to keep the masses subservient, basically numbing them to their economic and social misery so they wouldn't, revolt. And to really get Toole's track, you absolutely have to grasp this historical baseline.
The band didn't just throw together a generic anti-establishment anthem, they built a highly targeted modern critique squarely on top of this 19th century philosophy.
So Tool takes Marx's core idea and they update it for a modern audience. In the context of the song, Opiate represents the sedative of blind faith, something handed out by manipulative leaders. The track drops you right into this toxic dynamic from the very first line, with the singer stating, "Choices always were a problem for you. What you need is someone strong to guide you." It's this absolutely scathing critique of people who willingly surrender their critical thinking to authority figures simply because the burden of free will is just too heavy to carry.
Moving on to Section 2, Unpacking Shocking Metaphors.
Okay, this is where things get incredibly intense, so we really need to apply that academic lens we just set up. As the song builds to a massive crescendo, lead singer Maynard James Keenan is performing from the perspective of a false prophet. He sings, "My God's will becomes me. When he speaks through me." And that culminates in a deeply, deeply uncomfortable line, "We both want to rape you." Now, hearing that for the first time, it's shocking, seriously jarring. But remember, we're analyzing art through the lens of institutional critique here. We have to separate the literal from the metaphorical to understand what the source material is actually doing.
And this right here perfectly illustrates why context is quite literally everything. If you take that line literally, it sounds like some horrific endorsement of crude physical violence. But metaphorically, this incredibly harsh language is being used to represent the total violation of the mind, body, and soul by a corrupt institution. The band is deliberately using the most aggressive, visceral imagery possible to call out the predatory nature of cults and the grim reality of clerical abuse. It's a fierce condemnation of systemic exploitation, not a literal threat.
Which brings us to Section 3, a psychedelic tonal reset. So after hitting you with such a heavy, dark critique, you're kind of left breathless. And this is where the band throws in a fascinating structural quirk. If you were listening to the original CD back in the day, the main track ends, and you're just met with dead silence, several minutes of it. You totally think the album's over. But then, at precisely the 6-minute and 6-second mark, which, come on, is obviously a cheeky little nod to 666, a hidden song suddenly kicks in. It's called The Gaping Lotus Experience.
And the Gaping Lotus Experience is just a complete 180 from the main track. It basically satirizes people having terrible drug trips on acid and ecstasy. The lyrics ramble through these ridiculous stories, like a friend who dropped acid and literally thought he was a fire engine, or another guy on ecstasy who tried to marry every single person in the room and ended up ruining the living room furniture. It is completely unapologetically absurd. But structurally, it's actually a brilliant move. It serves as this essential, lowbrow tonal reset. It balances out that incredibly high-concept, intense religious philosophy we just talked about, basically reminding us that, hey, this band also has a deeply twisted sense of humor.
But wait, it gets even cooler, especially for the physical media nerds out there. Think about it. How do you hide a track on a vinyl record? On a CD, you just add digital blank space. On vinyl, Tool actually utilized a super rare manufacturing trick called a double groove. The pressing plant carved 2 parallel, entirely distinct grooves into the vinyl itself. So when you dropped the needle onto the record, you had absolutely no idea what you were going to get. Depending entirely on the microscopic chance of where that needle landed, you'd either hear the dark, heavy main song, or you'd instantly get the ridiculous hidden track about the fire engine. It was a physical roulette wheel built directly into the art. How cool is that?
Finally, let's look at Section 4, 30 Years of Evolution.
Tracking the timeline of this concept is a trip in itself. You start way back in 1844 with Karl Marx coining the initial philosophy. Fast forward over a century to 1992, and you get Tool dropping the raw, aggressive Opiate EP. But the story actually doesn't stop there. In 2022, exactly 30 years later, the band completely revisited this exact track, releasing a massive reimagined studio sequel titled Opiate Squared.
When you stack the two versions up against each other, it perfectly encapsulates the band's entire growth. Back in '92, their style was this raw punk metal, but by 2022, it had totally transformed into highly complex progressive rock. Honestly, the most telling change is in the break. Remember that absurdist hidden track with the ruined carpets? For the 2022 sequel, they completely scrapped it. They replaced it with this sprawling, 5-minute, wildly technical instrumental break. In a lot of ways, the history of Opiate is essentially the history of Tool, showing how they morphed from raw provocateurs into these atmospheric, progressive titans who rely on pure musical proficiency to tell their stories.
So, to wrap up our explainer today, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on.
If Marx and Toole were right about the sedation of the masses, if people really are eager to hand over their free will to someone strong who promises to guide them, where are these opiates operating in our society right now? Are we still mostly looking at traditional religious institutions, or have new modern leaders, maybe in tech or politics or mainstream media, taken up the mantle of providing blind faith for those who find choices a problem? It's a huge, complex question, but unpacking the foundational ideas in art like Opiate gives us the lens to actually examine it. Thanks so much for learning with me today.
Every time you run off back into your cozy little world without hitting like or subscribe, I get a little closer to this.